An important book in the history of global muckraking is the international bestseller King Leopold's Ghost, published in 1998. Written by noted historian Adam Hochschild, the book focuses on the barbaric conditions in the Belgian Congo at the turn of the 20th century. It also looks at the role that journalism played in the campaigns against those conditions. Hochschild believes that the struggle for rights in the Belgian Congo was one of the early great global human rights campaigns, as was the fight against slavery. During the colonial era, when the European powers were carving up Africa, King Leopold II of Belgium staked his claim on large areas of land around the Congo River. King Leopold wanted to capitalize on the new and growing international market for treated rubber. He became very rich through the forced labor, torture, and killing of the people of the Congo who had to gather the rubber. King Leopold's Ghost introduced millions of readers to three men who sounded the alarm about the atrocities: citizen journalist E.D. Morel, African-American soldier and writer George Washington Williams, and British consul Roger Casement. Williams, Casement, and Morel perfectly illustrate the global nature of muckraking. None of the men were from the Congo, but they wrote about it. None were Belgian, but they sought to influence its government. And they wrote at a time when changes in the media and in communication allowed information to spread. Here to tell us more is Adam Hochschild.
E.D. Morel was a British guy who was actually born in France. His father was French, his mother was British. In the late 1890s, he was a young employee at a shipping firm in Liverpool called Elder Dempster and Company. And Elder Dempster and Company had the monopoly on all cargo traffic between the Congo, which at that time was called the Congo Free State. It was the privately owned colony of King Leopold II of Belgium. Had monopoly on the cargo traffic between the Congo and Europe. And every couple of weeks, Morel, because he was bilingual in English and French, would be sent over to the Belgian port of Antwerp to check on his company's ships arriving from and departing to Africa. And he began to notice something, which was when these ships arrived in Antwerp, they were filled to the hatch covers with enormously valuable cargoes of ivory and wild rubber. And he knew that gathering both of those commodities, wild rubber especially, is a hugely labor-intensive business. But when the ships turned around and sailed back to Africa, they carried no merchandise in exchange for this ivory and rubber, no trading goods. Nothing was being sent to Africa to pay for all these riches that were coming back to Europe. Instead, the ships carried mostly military supplies, soldiers, firearms, ammunition. And watching this traffic on the docks of Antwerp, months after months, and getting rebuffed when he asked questions, Morel gradually realized that he was seeing evidence of a forced labor system of some sort that was going on thousands of miles away. Morel quit his job and in the space of 3 or 4 years turned himself into the great British investigative journalist of his time. And he worked 8, 10, 12 hours a day for the next 10 or 12 years, successfully putting on the world's front pages the story of the forced labor system in King Leopold's Congo. He wrote several full-length books, 36 pamphlets, hundreds of newspaper articles on this subject. And he found, as muckrakers all over the world do, that once you start publishing reliable information about something, other people who have news to contribute on the subject seek you out. And this is what happened with him. The people who had eyewitness accounts of how this forced labor system worked were British, American, and Swedish Protestant missionaries in the Congo, who had been writing about this sort of thing in missionary journals and getting ignored for quite a few years. But suddenly in Morel, they realized here was something who could get the information, here was somebody who could get the information they had onto the world's front pages. George Washington Williams, who was an African American who went to the Congo in 1890, was really one of the first writer eyewitnesses on the scene of the Congo atrocities. He actually went there expecting to find a civilized, prosperous colony that would have job opportunities for African Americans who faced all sorts of discrimination back in their homeland. And instead he found this horror show of a tremendous lust by Europeans to grow wealthy by exploiting rubber they hadn't really discovered yet at this point, but ivory. Williams wrote about this in a document called An Open Letter to King Leopold II, which was published in newspapers all over Europe and the United States. He was an extremely good self-promoter, this man. He got his stuff published. And it sort of sketched the outlines of this exploitative system, which remained in place for years to come. Very sadly, Williams died on his way home from Africa, never wrote the book that he was hoping to write about King Leopold's Congo. But he was sort of the first really loud dissenting voice. Then Morell started putting forth things that he had discovered, making use of information from missionaries. Roger Casement was an Irishman who was British consul in the Congo, and in 1904 published a report that was a description of an investigative journey he had made, which documented these abuses still further. Very important eyewitness account from that period. And Morell, of course, was able to use that, became good friends with Casement, and was able to use that to further his own agitation on this issue. It certainly helped that the world was, by this point, very much an international news market. The telegraph spanned the ocean. Something that was news in the American papers could be news in the British papers. People were also realizing that the world was knit together. The colonization of Africa on a huge scale had only begun really in a big way around 1870 or so. And in part, it too was made possible by communication and transportation technologies that hadn't existed earlier. The telegraph, the steamship, not to mention the machine gun and the repeating rifle. So the spread of information across national lines was happening at the same time. Because the world was very pleased with itself that it had, on paper, abolished slavery everywhere by the 1880s or so. Abolished in the United States, time of the Civil War, abolished in the British Empire in 1838, and abolished in other countries at different points. So on paper, slavery no longer existed, and in fact, one of the justifications for the European conquest of Africa, and in particular for Leopold's conquest of the Congo, was that he was stamping out the slave trade to the Arab and Islamic world, which still existed, trade across the Indian Ocean. But in fact, Leopold was enslaving people in a different way by turning them into forced laborers, gathering this wild rubber for him. There was a worldwide rubber boom starting in the early 1890s that was originally sparked by the invention of the inflatable bicycle tire in the late 1880s. Then, of course, the automobile came along, need for a lot more tires there, plus with expanding industry all over the world, rubber belts of one kind or another in factories, the expanding telephone and telegraph network of wires around the world, these were rubber coated. So there was a huge market for rubber, and this was why King Leopold of Belgium could make so much money from the wild rubber that he controlled in Africa. There was really a long series of ties between writers and activists on this issue in the struggle against slavery in the British Empire and the struggle against slavery in the United States. William Lloyd Garrison here in the United States was a journalist who published a newspaper, but he was also an anti-slavery activist. And in a way, a lot of what we think of as modern investigative journalism was pioneered by the British abolitionists in the 1790s and after, where they quite suddenly discovered that what really got people outraged about slavery was not biblical argument, but it was eyewitness descriptions of what slave ships looked like, what slave plantations looked like, and so on. And I think this has influenced investigative journalism ever since. And so when Morel started campaigning against the atrocities in the Congo, he did so making use of eyewitness descriptions of what was happening there, a lot of which was supplied to him by Congo missionaries. In the United States at that time, there was, this was the era of the muckrakers. You know, writers like Lincoln Steffens and Ida Tarbell, who targeted the abuse of power by major American corporations and the politicians in league with them. So that was certainly going on in the United States, and there were, you know, bits and pieces of journalism like it in other countries, but Morel was really a force unto himself. King Leopold was an absolute master of spin control. He could have taught today's American tobacco companies a thing or two. He was horrified to find himself vilified in newspapers all over the world, thanks to the efforts of E.D. Morel and the other Congo reformers. He pushed back by starting a propaganda magazine in English, French, and German called The Truth About the Congo, which he arranged to have distributed in luxury sleeper trains all over Europe. He owned stock in the International Railway Sleeper Car Company. He did his best to spread scurrilous information about Morel, tried to arrange to have people feed him false information on occasion, and you know, produced a great deal of counter-propaganda, which was not very effective. And he also paid off newspaper editors and correspondents in countries all over Europe, something we know a good deal about because one of his bagmen later wrote about it. They certainly were successful in making this the #1 human rights scandal of the first decade of the 20th century. No question about that. Thousands of newspaper articles on the subject appearing in the press all over the world. What they thought would cure the abuses was if the Congo were removed from the hands of King Leopold, who had it as his personal, privately owned colony, and became a Belgian Congo. And this happened finally in 1908 when Leopold was forced to give up the Congo. It became the Belgian Congo. But of course there was so much money to be made by having this forced labor system for gathering wild rubber that things continued mainly as they had been. There was a little bit of moderating of the abuses, but not a whole lot. The thing that really brought an end to the system was a collapse in the rubber price around 1912, 1914. And then by the early 1920s, the Belgian colonial authorities realized that if they continued the same system, the population was shrinking so dramatically that they would eventually have no labor force left. And you can actually find them saying this on paper. And at that point, they began treating people better, building hospitals and clinics for Africans, doing that kind of thing. When it became independent, there were certainly less than 3 dozen college graduates in the whole country. And this was a colony that had not in any way been prepared for independence or self-rule by Belgium. There had been no local elections or anything ever really. up until almost the last minute. I think it is a danger that when you agitate for a change to happen, the change gets made, and then all sorts of new problems arise. I mean, we saw that here in the United States, where there was tremendous coverage of activism during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And we got the Civil Rights Act, we got the Voting Rights Act, black people could vote in the South at last, and here we are, you know, half a century later, and a variety of very subtle measures, you know, voter picture ID, smaller number of polling places, all kinds of other things, are sapping the right to vote easily in a totally, you know, unjust and shocking way. And we thought we'd fixed this problem 50 years ago.